Right to it. Okay. Well, my desire is to hopefully tonight finish up so we can move towards prophecy, prophetic genre, prophetic books,
Mm,
Lord willing. So we've been taking some time looking at in more detail on preparing the sermon, putting it together, and so want to cover the last few points regarding that. Because again, remember the process is uh,
right.
many people, like with many things in life, many people kind of give more attention either to exegesis or the exposition to the neglect of the other one. And so we want to make sure we give attention to both, that we need to study the text, of course, understand it accurately. So we need to give attention to that, but not neglect the importance of um, putting those thoughts together, what we have studied, and being able to then explain it in a clear manner towards our hearers so that we accurately reflect the original author's intended meaning
Mm,
and at the same time help them understand that and know how it connects to them in the present. And that means we need to give attention not only to studying the text, the exegesis, we need to give attention to preparing the message, whether it's a sermon or a teaching or Bible study. Um, and often I have found that people tend to give too much attention to one or the other. So those of us who like to study, we may put a lot of effort in the study portion, and
mm,
and that's it's good. It's good to study. At the same time, though, we need to give effort to making it clear so it's understood by those that we are communicating with. And honestly, to make it clear to ourselves,
yeah.
we can understand, or study a passage and learn different words and the structure and how it fits in the flow and all that. But can you identify clearly yourself what the author is saying and how he's expressing that? Um,
Mm,
Rather than just grabbing a thought here or there, do we understand the main focus of what he is saying? So I think this process of putting a manuscript together is very, very helpful, not just helpful for those who we're going to teach, but helpful for ourselves in understanding what was said by the author. I know for me that is often the case where
mm, mm,
um, when I actually give it thought, I sit down and I try to write out, okay, what is he saying here? What is the focus and the structure and how does it connect to what he's been saying? And that's when it helps me get better clarity and understanding of the text by doing that. So we want to
mm,
study to understand the text, but then we want to spend time explaining it, putting together our thoughts. And I believe this a sermon manuscript is the best way to do that. Now, again, this isn't what you have to bring with you when you teach the message or the passage, but I think it's an important step in preparation for that. All right. So that said, we've been spending time on that other side, that second piece, the exposition part, putting together a manuscript, um, which includes, and this is where we've been focusing, um, introduction, a body, and a conclusion. And we've been spending a lot of time on the body of the sermon. That is for each outline point, been looking at the six P's: the point, proof, the picture, the persuasion, the plan,
mm, mm,
um, or said another way, right? The statement of the outline point, the explanation of the outline point, illustrating it. And again, illustration can be helping clarify the point, emphasize the point, or making it more memorable. All right. And then we have what we call persuasion, or the argumentation. And that is just simply the call for the hearer to respond. As we said before, the explanation, that's really the teaching side. The argumentation or persuasion, that's the preaching side, where you take now what you have taught
Mm.
and help your hearers understand it. And then how does this connect to them? They need to do something with it. So this is the call to respond. The application is then how to respond. And again, that's where we spent some time the last couple of sessions on that. Where I want to turn our attention tonight is to the last P, which we called the problem. Or really, by that I mean any questions that your hearers might have. We need to be able to anticipate those that we're teaching. We need to anticipate what questions may come up in their mind. Or are there any difficult doctrinal issues in the passage? Is there anything that may be a challenge to understand that you need to spend some time on? For example, I was teaching last week. I was at a men's conference, and we were going through 2 Corinthians 4. It actually was the passage that taught at the family camp
Mm.
there in with Tamandu
Yep.
a couple of years ago. But we were talking about this passage where Paul is speaking about his earthly tent. When it's torn down, we will have a building from God, a house not made with hands, eternal in heaven. So he's speaking here of his resurrection body and saying our earthly body is not going to last. It's like a tent.
Mm.
Our heavenly body is what we will receive from God. And then he's talking in verses 2 to 4 about, in this body we groan, longing to be clothed with our dwelling, right, from heaven. So he's talking about longing for this resurrection body. But then he starts discussing, putting on the resurrection body will not be found naked. That's without a body. For while we're in this tent, we groan, being burdened, because we do not want to be unclothed, but clothed.
Mm.
Again, the idea of unclothed, being without this resurrection body. To be clothed is to have a resurrection body, so that what is mortal will be swallowed up by life. Now he has prepared us for this very purpose, as God who gave us the Spirit as a pledge. So going through this passage, and he's talking about, okay, I don't want to be in my earthly body. I'd much rather be in my resurrection body in heaven. But then we have to think for a minute.
Mm.
And I addressed this with the men. I said, so, because some will ask, well, what about in between? Because we know that our resurrection body comes when Christ returned. Right? That's made clear in 1 Corinthians 15, 1 Thessalonians 4, that, Dwayne talked about the trumpet sound. When that trumpet sounds, then the dead in Christ will rise first. And so that's a bodily resurrection. And 1 Corinthians 15 talks about the same thing. When the trumpet sounds, the perishable will be raised imperishable, the twinkling of an eye. And so this resurrection body comes at Christ's return. But what if we die before then? We know that, and Paul's going to talk about this, while we're absent from the body, right? He says in verse 6, if we're in the body, we're absent from the Lord. Verse 8, if we're absent from the body, we're with the Lord. So we know at death, the believer is then immediately with Christ.
Mm.
But does he have a body?
Yep.
And so this is a theological question that this passage could raise in some people's minds. As you explain, the resurrection body, how wonderful it is, and when do we get it? We get it at the Christ's return, right? Well, what about in the meantime? If I die before then, do I have a body? Or and so I thought it was, even though this text is not explicitly addressing that issue, Paul doesn't give us an explicit answer. Um, it's still a question that could come up in people's minds.
mm,
Now, you can choose not to address it, perhaps because of time, or because maybe it's more advanced than you think the people you're speaking with, maybe more than they really need to focus on right now, or maybe you just want to not confuse anybody. So there are reasons you don't have to bring this up, but you may choose to. And so all this is just an example of the passage you're teaching. Make sure to ask yourself, is there anything here that might be confusing, that may address a doctrinal issue that they may have a question on, or perhaps it's controversial? You may be in a text that maybe is talking about homosexuality, and say in 1 Corinthians 7, it's talking about
mm,
these will not inherit the kingdom of God. And so in our culture, that would be a very controversial thing, and you may want to address that. You equip the people in your congregation to be able to know how to address that issue. So this is a pastoral decision,
mm.
um, with you as the teacher or the preacher need to decide, what is there a problem in this text that is an issue, a doctrinal concern, a question, a controversy that would be important to bring up. It may not be the main point. For example, the intermediate state, between death and the resurrection, that's not the key point of the text.
Mm,
The key point is longing for that resurrection body to be with the Lord, um, and being confident, knowing that we will receive that resurrection body because God has given us His Spirit as a guarantee. Those are the key thoughts that Paul's expressing. Uh, Talking about this intermediate state is not the key to the text. So if you are dealing with a problem, don't make it half your sermon, unless it's the key issue in the passage.
yep.
But this passage is not about the intermediate state. It's more of the present state and the future state with Christ in our resurrection body. So, but I chose to address it because I know this is an issue that people have questions about. It's very common. Like, what about in between? Um, so again, I think this is a decision you need to make as you're going through the text. And is this going to be an important issue for your hearers? Okay. So sometimes you may not deal with the problem from the passage at all, and that's perfectly fine. Um, but sometimes you may feel, this is a topic I think it's important for the my hearers to understand or know about. All right, so that comes through. You need to pray about this as you're going through the text. This is again why we need to be in prayer, dependent, not just to understand the passage, but then also, is there something here, Lord, that an important doctrinal issue or question or concern that my hearers need to understand? And so we need to prayerfully bring that before the Lord as well. I have a few um, eh, thoughts about that, but before we get there, I have some practical thoughts about how to introduce the topic and all that. But any questions or comments at this point regarding the problem, addressing the problem in the passage?
So, Pastor Tim, the problem here, or the Christians, is strictly related to the possible doctrinal or interpretive challenges from the text or the body of the text itself, right? It is not referring to if you know your audience well or the church well, you know that, say for example, the church is struggling with the issues of finance, all right, church
Yeah.
finance, all right,
Yeah.
and the text talks about it a little bit, but it's not really the main part of the text. So you are saying that we shouldn't kind of go into that, but we should deal with the problem that is theological or doctrinal problems that arising from the text itself. Like what you talk about Second Corinthians 4 just now, which is the issue of how does it look like in the intermediate state for
Right.
believers. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, that remember that you always want to be connected to the passage. So let's say you're
Mm.
teaching the Second Corinthians 5 passage, and you know there's a concern about giving in the church.
Yep.
Now you got to be careful, all right? Because this passage really doesn't address that or it's connected to that at all. So, you might be tempted, to look at verse 5,
Yeah.
right? Look, God gave us the Spirit. How is your giving? Are you giving? And then you go off into a discussion about giving. Um,
Yeah.
well, that's really far from, I think, we want our application, we want every part of our, as we go through the passage, whether it's the explanation, the illustration, the persuasion, the application, the plan, or the problem, need to be connected to the text
Mm.
so that um, otherwise, then you're just using the passage to accomplish what you want to say
Yep.
and
Yep.
not what God wants to say. And
Yep.
so when we're talking about a problem or an application or illustration, it needs to have a link to the text. Now again, the
Mm.
problem may not be a main issue from the passage, um, like the intermediate state. It's not a main issue.
Mm.
You can be saved whether you think you have a body before the resurrection or not. Um, but it's still pretty closely connected. It's a question that could come up in
Mm.
relation to this discussion about a resurrection body. And so,
Yep.
but like, I'm actually going to preach this text at another church in uh, coming up, and I'm not going to talk about this. The church
Mm.
is kind of young. A lot of their believers there aren't really mature in the Lord, and so this is like, I'm just going to confuse them with it, and so I'm for them, I'm not going to bring it up,
Mm.
um, because I just don't feel like at the stage they are at in their walk with Christ, I don't think this will be helpful. It might be confusing because people have all these questions and they won't really focus on the main point of the text. So again, this
Mm.
is a decision you need to make prayerfully, the guidance of the Spirit and just wisdom, understanding your hearers and whether or not this will be helpful for them to understand better as you go through.
Yep.
Just
Yep.
like application, it's the same thought process. It's like,
Mm.
do I know my hearers well enough that I can suggest specific ways to apply the text, but it has to be connected to the text. So if I
Yep.
give an application as, are you giving? Um, I'm really, I think, veering off from this passage. Now, of course, I could say true things about giving, but I'm really sort of imposing my thoughts and opinions and just using this passage to do that. Now,
Yep.
if I'm preaching through Second Corinthians, I know in chapters 8 and 9 I'm going to hit the
Yes.
topic of giving. So I'll just wait.
Yep.
I'll wait till
Yep.
then.
Yep. Thank you. Yeah. So what I'm hearing, Pastor Tim, is that the example of Second Corinthians 5 don't use the word God gave us a spirit and use that as a launching pad to address a problem that we know about the church is facing.
Yeah.
Don't use a launching pad because that's not being faithful to the text itself, which is talking about the longing of Christ coming back, and save that until chapter 8 or chapter 9 on the
Yeah.
issues of giving. Yeah. Okay.
Or if you feel it's a big enough issue, just have a special sermon or sermon series on the topic and use a
Mm,
passage that is directly related
yeah.
to that. But yeah, if I'm in Second Corinthians, I'll just wait till I get to chapter 8.
Mm,
But
mm, mm,
if I'm not, you know, like we did that at our church. The elders asked me, said, we haven't talked about giving in a long time. So can you do a series on giving? So you know, I use Second Corinthians 8 and 9 as one text, and then
mm,
Matthew
mm,
6 as another, First Timothy 6, and I address giving from passages that were directly focused on
mm,
that
mm.
topic.
Yeah. Thank you.
So really problem, yes, is it's a pastoral decision that you need to make. One, will this be helpful to my hearers to better understand this, or is this a question that's that I know they have? And then two, don't make it the dominant point of your passage.
Mm,
Um, unless it's the main topic. If
yep.
you're in Ephesians 1, it says just as he chose us in him before the foundation of the world, that's talking about election. That definitely is a doctrinal, controversial doctrinal topic, and it has a lot of questions connected to it. And in
Mm,
that text, that's the focus is God's choosing uh, of those he would save. And so in that case, you will spend a lot of time on the quote unquote problem of the passage because that's the main point of
mm,
it. But if it's not the main point, it's just something that, as you think about application or as you think about, the question the hearers might have from this, that you discuss that.
yep.
Just be careful of rabbit trails that become the main trail when it's not the main trail or
Mm,
path of the passage. Um, but like I said, with the church that I was at teaching this text last week, they were pretty mature body. And again, this is a general topic that or question that many people have. And so, and afterwards, several guys came up and said, "Yeah, I was always wondering about that." So I'm glad you mentioned that or talked about it. That really helped. So,
mm.
okay. Any other comments, thoughts, or
Thank you.
questions? I'll give you a few more details on this. Um, a way to bring it up might be you might say something like, so like you're teaching through the text, and let's say this problem or question isn't the main focus. So how do you bring it up without making it confusing? I would say something like, now there may be some here you're asking yourself this question.
Mm, mm,
So what I would do is I'd repeat the main point. So if I'm preaching through 2 Corinthians 5, I'm focused on the main idea here is, you know, Paul's longing for his resurrection body. But
mm,
but notice here he talks about being naked and clothed and groaning, and you might be asking yourself, what does he mean by that? And what if we die before Christ's return? Will there be a body? Um, and so I might, just ask that question in that way, but I want to make sure they understand the main point. So I might repeat that before asking that question. And then even when I finished, I said, now wherever you think about this issue and whether it's made sense to you or not, let's remember what the main focus of this text is. It's not on whether we have a body or not before the resurrection. The focus is longing for that body at the resurrection,
mm,
and that's the motivation for us to live for Christ now. So I then brought it back after discussing the problem. I brought it back to the main point of the main outline point. All right.
Mm.
Um, don't avoid these questions, from the text. Uh, Again, this is the decision on your part whether or not you think enough of your hearers would have this question or concern or um, confusion. And you may ask, well, how do I know what problems are in the text? Are there questions from the passage? So that's where commentaries can be helpful because they will bring it up. They love to talk about the problems, and this and that view. And so you might, as you're reading the commentary, they bring it up. And you might think, oh, this is actually something that might be helpful to discuss or to bring up in the message. Or it may not, just ignore it and move on. Commentators like to bring up lots of problems that, doesn't really help anybody to know the answer to, and it just will confuse people. But that's where commentaries or you may listen to another sermon on the passage and they bring it up. So, but make sure at least to ask yourself as you're going through preparing the message, make sure to ask yourself, is there a problem here or a question that would be important to consider bringing up? Okay. So at least ask yourself if that's a possibility. And then you can pray about and consider whether you should bring it
Mm.
up. And if it is a doctrinal issue, or you may want to just mention the different views. I did that with the intermediate state. It's basically there's you know two main explanations here. Some believe that when you die and you're with Christ, that you're in a bodiless state, um, called the intermediate state, and then when at Christ's return we receive the resurrection body. And then I would explain that. And then now some say that we do have sort of an intermediate body. In fact, Samuel in 1 Samuel 28, when he was called from the grave, uh, he had an appearance. He was able to be recognized by Saul. Or Moses and
Mm.
Elijah at the Transfiguration, they had a bodily form.
Mm.
Um, so so you may want to bring that up and say, so there is a possibility that we do have a body, and then you need to express, but I believe because of what Paul says here, and you may have another passage, um, then present what you believe uh, Scripture teaches. Again, don't make this half of your sermon, but I think it is helpful for people to understand. Now, if you don't have time and you just want to bring up the point and just your view, that's fine. You don't have to go into all the different opinions and views. But just keep in mind, there will be some who may have that opinion, that, well, no, I remember about Samuel and they recognized him and he had a body, it seems like. So, and if you don't bring that up or talk about that main difference, then um, you won't help that person to understand your view. So, again, this takes just really wisdom on your part in kind of how much to go into the question, how long to take, how important is it, and all those things. Now, those of us who tend to be the academic guys that like to study, our tendency will be to want to address every problem and in the text and bring up these things and go through the views and be careful, because then the passage just becomes a launching pad for a bunch of doctrinal topics that may not be the main point of the text.
Mm.
And we don't want, as always, We got to remember this, brothers, that how you teach is how people will read. How you teach the Bible is how they will read the Bible. How you approach explaining a passage, do you go through the context? Do you help them see the main point? Do you help them understand the flow of thought? That how you teach them is how they're going to, when they are on their own and they read the Bible, that's the hermeneutics they're going to use. So if you go
mm,
to a passage all the time and just talk about views and doctrinal issues, and then that's exactly how they're going to read the Bible. They're not going to read to find the main idea of the author. They're just going to be
mm,
looking for doctrinal problems.
mm.
So again, this is why we're going through all of this and going through a careful process and understanding the text, and then a careful process in explaining and going through the passage, because it will impact how the people you're teaching, it will impact how they read and study the Bible themselves.
Okay.
All right. So just another caution when you're addressing um, problem or issue in the text. And here I already mentioned, know the culture of those you're preaching to anticipate where they may have questions or objections, concerns. Again, this each congregation or each group you teach, depending on where you are and who they are. Um, if it's a bunch of, if I'm teaching Second Corinthians 5 to a bunch of kids, I probably won't talk about the intermediate state with them. I'll just talk about, someday receive a resurrection body if you know Christ. And then I would, of course, use that,
Mm.
preach the gospel to them. But um, I would just talk about, even though we're young, someday, you have grandparents, someday we get old and we die. And what will happen when you die? Well, if you're love Jesus and you're a follower of Jesus, then someday you will get a new body. And I'll just focus on that, not the intermediate state with those kids. All right. So again, depends on who you are teaching and what their needs are, what what will be helpful for them. All right. Any questions or comments so far? All right. One more thought here. Um, the question, this kind of goes with Yuchai's question. Should I bring it up from the text if not hardly anyone from the congregation knows or cares about it?
No.
Again, um, your hearers may not have a question, but it may be an important topic for them to address with others. I think I mentioned the example a moment ago. Um,
Mm.
I'm trying to remember what example I gave you. Um, I've forgotten, but
No, just now you're mentioning about the one the elders asked you to speak about givings,
uh-huh.
and then
Well, I
after that,
just it may be a when you're trying to think through, okay, do I bring up this problem or not? Do I address it or not? These are three principles or approaches that I think about
mm,
to decide whether or not I'm going to bring up the topic. The first is, will it equip them to deal with objections that others may have about this issue? So if they get into conversations, will this be helpful for them to know how to address that? Is it an important issue theologically or doctrinally or applicationally? Is this important?
mm,
Um, You need to ask yourself that question. And then eventually, is it going to help them know and love, Christ more?
Yes.
Um, or is this just some, trivia fact that you're giving them? Is it going to be helpful in that way as well? All right. So those would be just these are some suggested questions to ask yourself as you're thinking about, should I bring this up? And again, I should probably be explicit on this. Commit this to prayer.
Mm.
Ask the Lord if it is something um, that you should address. Okay. All right. These are just my it's my opinion, it's my suggestions for you as you consider whether or not to bring up the problem in the text. Okay. And then just in our tone, how we address the topic. Be careful not to approach it like you're arguing with somebody. But remember, look at this pastorally. How can this be helpful
Mm.
to my hearers? Not this is my view and these guys that have the other view, they're idiots. They're stupid. They don't know anything. This is the right view. And
Yeah.
probably not the best approach. Be more pastoral and just explaining. But then again, the idea is I want this to be helpful to the hearers. This isn't just an academic topic that you know just interesting, or I want to prove my point or whatever. It's
Mm.
is this going to be helpful for my hearers to understand this, or at least think about it? It might be a problem they never even realized or thought about, and it may come up one day for them. But so it's good if you address it. So again, so to me, the problem, the sixth P, the problem is a pastoral shepherding
Yep.
um,
Heart.
issue. Okay.
Yep. Yep.
All right. And that said, again, looking at these, six P's, if you will, point, proof, picture, persuasion, plan, and problem. Um, Not every outline point needs to have all six of these. All
Okay.
right. As you're thinking about it, you may have time to cover all of this, or so definitely you want to state the point. All right. That's for clarity so people can follow you. They know what the focus is in this point. You need to explain it. That's also required.
Mm.
Okay. So those two are, to me, requirements. They need to understand the text. And so you need to state the main or the point of the outline point and then explain it. Um, I think the persuasion I would also include as calling them to respond to the point. What are they going to do with it? To me, those are the three things that are a requirement as you're teaching through the passage. Now, illustrations, definitely I would try to use them as much as possible in application. So I would hope for, my goal is to that, I would have all five of these, but I'm just giving you sort of a priority. If you're limited on time, um,
Mm.
that to me, this make sure you state the point, you explain it, and you call for a response. Now, if you're able to then also illustrate it, give application, then great. Now, the problem, I would say that this last one, um, to me, that's again, if there is time or if this topic you think is important enough from the passage to address it, but I would put it as a third level priority. So the green would be first level priority. The yellow would be second level.
Mm.
Um, Try to do it, try to incorporate it. The third one would be, if you can, that's great. But um, the green, the point, proof, and persuasion to me is an absolute minimum requirement, first level. Okay. Because you're going to need to consider like time. Okay, right now I only have 30 minutes to go through this message, and I have three outline points with an introduction conclusion. Even if my introduction and conclusion are short, 5 minutes, that gives me 25 minutes for three outline points. So that's about 8 minutes for each one. So right away you can see
Mm.
I may not have time to go through like a problem in this passage. And this is another thing that I think a manuscript helps us with is seeing like, um, oh man, my first point is like three times the length of the other two. Um, Now that may be okay. Maybe the text requires that first point requires more time and attention, but at least you can see that as you put the manuscript together. Because what happens a lot is, we start preaching through the text and we end up spending all our time on the first point and don't give any much time to the second or the third because we haven't thought about it ahead of time. And so it may be in your text, the second point was the bigger one. But if you spent all your time on the first one, then you won't give much attention to the second one. So I'm going to talk about
Mm.
that in a minute, just why I think a sermon manuscript is helpful. But um, give some thoughts. So you have each outline point, you have these 6 P's. And like I said, I think to me, really three of them are must-haves: the point, the proof, and the persuasion. The want to have is picture and the plan, and then nice to have would be a problem if you have time for that.
Mm.
Okay. And as well as you look at these 6 P's, don't assume that I mean you have to follow this exact order. Um, Certainly the point needs to be first, and then explaining it. But you may jump right to the application,
Okay.
or as you're going through your explanation of the point, you may have one or two or three illustrations that you mix in with the explanation. So you explain part of it, there's an illustration, another part of the point, an illustration. So don't just you don't have to, give all the explanation of the whole verse and then come back and illustrate one part of the verse. The illustration should be connected directly to that specific part of the verse you're explaining. Same with application. Uh, you might want to include an application as you're explaining part of the point. Okay, so you don't have to follow this order. You do need to, I think, 1 and 2, at least one you need to do at the beginning, and then 2, start explaining the text, but you may then incorporate illustration or application, persuasion. That'll just be at your discretion. Okay. Just incorporate these things as you see best as you go through the passage. Um, let me make comment about and put this here. Give me a second. I want to talk a little bit about when you transition between points, okay? As you go right from point one to point two to point three, let me give you some suggestions for that. Just so again, the our goal is to be clear.
Mm,
So this is my suggestion to help you be clear, to help people be able to follow you. And that's what clear means. They can follow you. Um, they understand you. They can see what you are saying, how it's connected to the passage. So as you transition, let's say you finish the first point, the outline point. Now you're moving to the second one. I would suggest the following. As you end that first point and go to the second point, repeat that first point. So we've seen here in 2 Corinthians 5, Paul's longing and our longing for the resurrection body. Now, now notice what how can Paul be certain that he will have this resurrection body? Well, look with me at verse 5. So Paul now has expressed this longing for a resurrection body. Verse 5 tells us the certainty of the resurrection body. Okay, so I've repeated my previous point. I've made a connection now between that previous point and the next point, and then I've stated the next point. Okay, so
mm,
again, notice from verses 2 to 4, Paul has expressed this longing for his resurrection body. How can he be confident that he will have that resurrection body? So we see now from moving from this longing to a resurrection body, now the certainty of a resurrection body. Look at verse 5. Okay, so you're linking them, the points together. You're helping them see that. You remind them of the point you just made. And now you're going to introduce the next outline point. And then you've also bridged them together. All right. So this makes it easy. And again, I referenced the verses. From verses 2 and 4, we saw Paul's longing for a resurrection body. Now in verse 5, we see the certainty of a resurrection body. Okay. So now they track with you. Okay. Now we're going to verse 5. And the focus here will be on the certainty of the resurrection body. Okay. So again, clarity. They can follow. That's easy to follow because sometimes people are lost. As Dwayne's talked about, you're looking at the people and you can tell they're just drifting. They don't know where you are. They're distracted. Sometimes that's because they've lost you. They don't know where you are in the passage or what's going on. And that may be their fault. It may be our fault as the teacher. But if I repeat that point, state the verses, then tell them the next point and the verse, oh, okay, now I've got them back, hopefully. If not, then we'll be telling the story about the pigs on the farm, right, Dwayne? So we want to we want to make sure we can help them follow us by doing this, by being clear at where we are as far as our outline is concerned. Okay. Now, what should you include in that transition? Summarize the current outline point, restate the sermon main point, transition to the next, and then the next. So it's kind of like I'm breaking down the first part here into specifics, but I already explained that. Okay. So it's sort of this, you're briefly looking back to the previous point, restating it, and then you're looking forward to the next point, And then how are those two connected together? And it's really just three sentences. You're going to state the previous point, you're going to give the connection between them, and then you're going to state the new point. So don't go into this long explanation yet. You'll do that when you get to the point. Right now, you're just transitioning from the previous point to the next point. And make that clear. So, like if you have let's say your sermon main idea was, three principles of powerful prayer. All right, then so far we've looked at the first principle of powerful prayer, and that is to pray frequently. Pray frequently. The second principle we see from the passage here in verse 7 is to pray fervently. Pray fervently. So in verses 5 and 6, our focus was pray frequently, but now notice the focus in verse 7 is pray fervently. And then read verse 7. Again, so you've told them where you've been, and now you're telling them where you're going. All right. Questions, comments, thoughts about that? Disagreements?
Now, now I was just thinking, Pastor Tim, you're talking about the transition. Or actually two things. I'll talk about the first thing first. Is I know that I make that kind of mistake, and it's easy as well. Let's say the Second Corinthians 5, and Paul was the main point, as you stated, is the longing, all right, between the earthly body and the resurrection body. And one of the pitfalls is that we don't keep that main point in focus, which is the longing. We talk about the resurrection body that we will have when Jesus returns. And even that, well, it is in the text, the resurrection body. And even that, one of the pitfalls is talk about there will be a resurrection body when Jesus return in Second Corinthians 5, and then quickly jump into other passages, either Paul or another New Testament author talking about the resurrection body, such as First Corinthians 15 and so on. And then it kind of blur the main point away. So the audience is like, the church is now listening more the big portion of this time is dedicated to the resurrection body. Taking idea from First Corinthians 15, the trumpet call, the twinkling of an eye, what death is swallowed up in victories. They're all very fine, but it veer away from the main point, which is the longing, because Second Corinthians 4, Paul talks about the earthly, oh, no, sorry, earlier passages Paul talks about the earthly tent that is wasting away. We are perplexed, but we are not without hope, things like that. So the pitfall was, is, I'm not sure how to explain this. It's like the dessert became the main course.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's the challenge. Again, this is going to depend on who you're teaching.
Mm.
If they don't know much about the resurrection body, then you may want to spend more time on that.
Yeah.
So that's really a consideration. Paul doesn't spend a lot of time on it here. He
Mm.
mentions the resurrection back, I think, in chapter 4, verse 14. He talks about it. But I think partly that's because he spent a lot of time in his first letter to the Corinthians in chapter 15. He spent a lot of time talking about it. But your hearers may not have
Yeah.
read or know about First Corinthians 15. So they don't have
Mm.
that background. And why would Paul long for this resurrection body? What about this body is so great? So you may decide you want to spend extra time on that topic because it will help them see why he's longing.
Okay.
So that
Mm.
again, back to a decision on your part. Again, this is the case whenever you explain any passage. there are certain parts of that that may require more explanation
Mm.
because your hearers may not be as familiar with it. Um,
Yep.
so when I preached through this passage last weekend, again, I knew most of the guys there were pretty mature, but I still went back and I just reminded them from 1 Corinthians 15, what do we know about this resurrection body?
Mm.
Imperishable, without sin, you know, walk through walls, all these kinds of things. Incorruptible, right? It's imperishable, incorruptible, powerful, eternal.
Mm.
So then I did spend a moment and say, brothers, imagine that being a body that we're not going to be tempted to sin. We won't be tired. We won't, you know. Um, so that's going to help them understand why this longing is there. Because the body I have now is corruptible. It is temptable. It's weak, right? As Paul said, it's decaying. The outer man's decaying.
Mm.
So that's why we groan in this. It's just, I want to be out of this thing. I want my new body. I don't want this one anymore. Um, well, what's so great about this new body? Well, you might want to spend time on that. Now, you, you spend time on that, and then you say, well, when do we get this resurrection body? Well, and then you may end up, getting into this whole discussion of Christ's return, and you got to be careful. You may end up in dealing with, eschatology things when that may not, you know, maybe that should be another message at another time. All that is important is that when Christ returns, we have this resurrection body. Well, when is his return? What are the signs? Well, that's sort of a secondary
Mm.
issue. It's important, but it's not. It like I said before, if you get too much, that would be kind of the problem thing I mentioned before. If you get too much, if you pull too much of these things in to talk about, you're going to lose track of the main focus of the text if you're not careful. So, um, but like I said, maybe as you're going through the passage, you realize, I haven't really talked to them about eschatology at all or the resurrection or all this. So you may want to do a special separate message on that. But again, that's a pastoral decision. So the idea is explain enough so that your hearers understand and know how it fits into what the author's saying. So again, why would Paul long for this resurrection body? Well, because he knew what that resurrection body is going to be like. And so it will help them understand that longing and then hopefully in them generate a longing right in your hearers so that they would be motivated
Yeah.
to be remain steadfast in the ministry.
Mm.
Good. Anything else? Any other thoughts or comments? Let me briefly move to the third element here of the sermon. We have the body, the introduction, the body, and then a conclusion. Don't just end the message, right? We need to, now that we've given them we've explained the text and we've hopefully helped them see the main point of the passage, and the structure. We've given them ways to apply the passage. Now you're coming to a close. You want to refocus them back on the main thrust of the text, the main focus of the passage, the main idea.
Mm.
So the conclusion give attention to it. Remind hearers that the main point is. Maybe call again for a response. And I say end the message smoothly. By that, I mean, so you remind the hearers of the main point of the passage might be, telling a story, an illustration that sort of focuses attention on that main point. For example, this text in 2 Corinthians 5, I ended it with the story of Ignatius. You remember he was early church father. He followed Peter as the bishop of Antioch back in the early 2nd century. And during his life, at the end of his life, there was an intense persecution by Emperor Trajan, Roman Emperor Trajan. And so Ignatius was he was captured because he was a leader in the church. He was captured, and they took him on a 1,500-mile journey back to Rome to execute him, to throw him to the lions. And on his way to Rome, he was visiting. He was still proclaiming the gospel, even as the Roman soldiers were marching him along. He proclaimed the gospel. Believers would come to him. He would encourage them. And then he found out that the believers in Rome wanted to help him escape when he got to Rome. So he wrote a letter. It's you can look it up, one of the 7 letters of Ignatius, the letters to the Romans. And in the letter, he tells them, don't try to free me. Don't deliver me.
Mm.
He says, I'm ready. Let the animals tear me apart. And said, don't interfere. He was concerned for their own safety, but more so, he was like, I'm ready to go.
Mm.
And so I told the story, and then I said, why was he so willing to die, and even die in a terrible way? He talked about being crushed by the animals, and then he says in there, basically, I can't remember his exact quote, but something like, because I'm awaiting for my new body and being with the Lord. And so he captured the whole focus of the text of 2 Corinthians 5 in that statement. So it's a story that, one, it'll get attention, but it's also, I'm trying to draw them to the main idea of the passage. And that is, look, here's an example of someone who was motivated to preach the gospel, to live for Christ because of his future hope in the resurrection. And so that, oftentimes an illustration or a story or quote, or perhaps a stanza from a poem or a song, some way that really captures the focus of the text in a memorable way. So I think a conclusion is a helpful way to do that. I had one seminary professor, he would say, make it like Velcro. Velcro is that something, it sticks.
Mm.
I don't have any Velcro with me here, but basically it's like, make it something that'll stick, that they'll remember.
Yeah, I have one here.
There you go.
Yeah.
So yeah, a lot of times I know when we get to the end of the message, maybe we're short on time. Some guys just say, thank you, you're
Let's close in
excused.
prayer.
Yeah. Or other guys, yeah, let's go to prayer. And there have been times I've done that where I've said, because of time, I won't have time to go through a long illustration or anything. So I'll just say, but instead of just saying, okay, now let's pray, I might say, okay, so we've seen here, the focus is on this future resurrection body. Before I pray, I want you to spend a moment, talk to the Lord. Do you have a longing for this body? And if not, why not? Or do you think about it very much? So I want to give you a moment just to prayerfully talk to the Lord Or I might say, is there some ways as we've gone through the text that you've just um, felt felt a conviction about something, or I just want to give you a moment to reflect on this passage and talk to the Lord. So rather than rush to end it, I want them to pause and give thought about it. And so I might do that in prayer, or maybe we end in a song that's connected to the passage. The song, I am the resurrection and the life. He who believes in me will never die, So maybe we'll sing that song, or just something again connected to the passage and the focus of the text. But don't just end it. That same professor who talked about Velcro, he said, don't crash the plane, land it. He said, very important. The takeoff, the introduction, the body is in flight, and then the conclusion is your landing. Don't crash the plane.
Mm.
You know, help them focus on what's the main idea, make it memorable, call to respond. So, ending the message smoothly, land the plane smoothly. Okay. Any comments or thoughts about that? Questions?
No, I was having a bit, I just recall something that the guy was really running short of time and he was rushing to finish the sermon. And then he said, let's close in prayer. And then he must have thought that he has not quite finished. So the
Yeah.
prayer become really long and he was adding points to the sermon.
Yeah. 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 I've seen that where the prayer is not really, you're not talking to God, you're still talking to the hearers.
It's like watching you go to a cinema, the movie has basically finished, the curtain come down, and then suddenly the curtain open again, and the guy say, "Yeah, I still got one more point to talk about."
Yeah. We're not done. Yeah. Um, Last thing, let me just comment briefly on this before I let you guys go. Um, I want to make the case for, writing a
Mm,
manuscript before the message. Um, Again, you don't have to do this. It's not a right wrong thing, but I think it is something that will be highly, very helpful in you being clear and explaining the text. Because first, if you write it out ahead of time, it allows you to think about what you want to say and how to say it. And again, I'm not talking about what you have to bring with you in the pulpit. You don't have to bring anything with you in the pulpit.
mm,
That's up to your style and what makes you most effective. But if you've at least thought beforehand, thought through what you want to say and how, um, it will be helpful. I mean, it also allows you to think ahead about illustrations and application. Some of us are quick on our feet. We can think about it in the moment. Things come to mind, but that's not me. I have a hard time with illustrations. So it's good if I think about ahead of time. So if I'm explaining the point, and then I think about, okay, what are some possible illustrations that will be helpful here? So it allows you to think ahead about that and application as well. All right. So I think it allows you to think about what you want to say, and specifically to that, it allows you to think about the illustrations and applications. It allows you to think about how do you want to um, say a particular point. Sometimes thinking through, especially if it's not an easy point um, or comment, it's helpful to have time to think about how you want what will be the best way to communicate that clearly. So the manuscript just helps you to think about, again, that ahead of time. Now, this doesn't mean you won't have thoughts come to you as you're teaching. That's totally fine. The Spirit will work as He wills, but don't presume that's going to be the case. Again, we're back to Timothy's being diligent, not only to handle accurately, but also, to explain clearly. So I think a manuscript will help us to do that. All right. And it's also, as you put together a manuscript, I think it'll help you remember the points you want to cover easier while you teach them, while you preach them. Another is if you're thinking ahead of time, if you put a sermon manuscript together, it'll allow you to think about your hearers more as you write it out. And again, that will affect your application or even your illustration. Or if you want to address a problem or a question in the passage. All right. That's not a decision you want to always be making in the moment.
Mm.
It's something you want to prayerfully consider ahead of time. All right. So again, I'm not trying to limit what can happen as you're teaching or preaching the passage and things that come to mind. I would expect that. We need to allow for that. But I don't think that means that I shouldn't think about what I want to say beforehand. All right. Even Spurgeon, right? He's always pointed to as like, well, he came up with his outline the night before, right? Classic Spurgeon. Saturday night, right after dinner, he would excuse his guests and then go up and spend a couple hours. And he would essentially, all he would do is come up with an outline
Mm.
to the text. So people think, well, he didn't give much thought. He didn't write out a manuscript. Well, I have two responses. One is we're not Spurgeon. But secondly, he had been studying and thinking about the passage all through the week. So it wasn't that he didn't give any preparation at all until the night before. He would think about the text and then put his thoughts together in a way, an outline that could be followed. And then Spurgeon was just able to communicate. That outline, though, was his guide. All right. But he did give thought beforehand. In fact, you can see, a friend of mine, a pastor at the church I was just at, showed me Spurgeon's sermon notes.
Wow.
He had a page from Spurgeon's. Spurgeon would write out notes for his sermons, thoughts and ideas. Now, he may not have come up with a full manuscript. He didn't bring a full manuscript into the pulpit. He had just had his outline. But he still thought about what he wanted to say beforehand. So there's
Mm.
evidence of that. He showed me one of the page he got. I don't know where he got it, but I've seen several of Spurgeon's sermon notes. So even Spurgeon gave thought ahead of time. Now, again, we're not Spurgeon, so I think we should give more thought ahead of time as far as preparing the message. Okay, again, it doesn't limit you and what you want to say, but at least it will guide you and give a direction and be helpful. It also helps you to know like how long your message might be, right? If you write it out, it'll give you an idea. Like I said before, you may write it out and realize that you're spending all your time on, most of your time on just one point. You realize, oh, I need to balance this out more. I need to give more attention to the second and third point. It'll help you know okay, I've got this many words. That means this message is probably going to be around, this message will be 90 minutes if I preach. So I need to either cut it in two or take some stuff out. So it gives you an opportunity to be thoughtful about, be prepared for how long it will take,
Mm.
um, as well. All right. So, and then I think if you have a written manuscript, sometimes people ask for your sermon notes, and you choose to give it to them or not, but it's helpful if you have, or like, for example, when I preach different places, they want to translate it because they may have, like, for example, when I go in Philippines, one of the churches, they have a Tagalog service and they want to preach the same message. So they'll ask me for the notes so they can translate it into Tagalog. The church I was
Mm.
at not long ago, they have a Spanish ministry, and they wanted, what they typically do is have the message given to the Spanish. So they asked if they could have a manuscript. So it's helpful for them to be able to, if I have a manuscript written out. Now, when I preached, I may not have covered all that in the manuscript, but at least they have that. So, or if you want to preach the same text later, um, you you already have a message put together, and now you may want to adjust it for the different group you're speaking to, but at least you have uh, a core message already put together, so you don't have to start all over. So these are advantages for me considering a manuscript. Um, Now, when you go in the pulpit, I bring a full manuscript with me, but some people just bring an outline. Some people bring no notes. Some people bring an outline with a few, like an illustration, or so that's really up to you. What's going to be most helpful for you in in preaching or teaching. But whatever you bring in the pulpit, I still think having a manuscript written out ahead of time in preparation for the sermon is a helpful process. So that's my uh, view or opinion on that. I don't know. What do you guys think? Do you
Pastor
guys?
Tim, I was just, well, it's something that I've been learning. It is important to spend time thinking and praying. Of course, the whole sermon and so on, and the conclusion, and you take, say, a 35 minutes, 40 minutes sermon. It is important in the conclusion to repeat the main idea or the timeless truth. It may be in different way or the same way, but that's okay. But at least is to help the church to say, well, that was actually the whole focus of this sermon all about. Um, and I know that I know it's kind of doesn't work. It does not so much a conclusion. Sometimes I will sometimes not all the time. I'll ask my family after the sermon's finished, we got home or whatever in the car. What is the main thing you remember about the sermons or my sermon? All right. And if they say there's so many things in there, I don't really know what you are driving at, It's like presenting a smorgasbord or a buffet, and they can't tell. So I know that then the whole homiletics has not been worked through carefully to keep the main thing as the main thing.
Yeah,
And it's not easy, especially you got a long passage and there's just so many main idea in it.
yeah. I think that's why a conclusion can help you with that. It's
Yeah.
like bringing it back all together again.
Mm.
And everyone's at a different place in
Yeah.
life and different situation. And so sometimes, your main point isn't going to be what they remember. It'll be one of something you said in one of your outline points that sticks with them
Yeah.
because it meets them where they're at. So we want to
Mm, mm,
make sure we understand that the word of God
mm.
is living and active, and the Spirit will use the word in different ways with different people. We just need to be faithful to accurately, explain it and call people
Yep.
to respond, to be clear, and then how the Spirit uses it. That's his decision.
Mm. Yeah.
I think too, writing a manuscript also um, is helpful because then as you go through it, you may realize, oh, I didn't really focus on the gospel anywhere in this text, in the sermon. So
Mm,
there's things
mm.
you can, as you write it out, it'll remind you, oh, that I didn't really have any application in the whole message. So I should,
Yep.
I need to consider, or I didn't focus on the gospel here, or Christ wasn't as central as he needs to be, and sometimes when
Mm,
you
mm.
write out something and then you go back and look at it, you're able to check and make sure um, as you go through the message. But if you don't do that, what can often happen is we end up saying the same thing. Um,
Yep.
if we don't prepare ahead of time, I think you'll end up all your messages will kind of sound like the same thing after a while if you're not careful. So I think writing it out ahead of time helps us to keep connected to the passage. Am I explaining, illustrating, applying? Um, is the gospel there? These are things you can be able to reflect on and look at because you've written it out. If you don't have anything prepared ahead of time, then you won't be able to check on those key things as you're preaching the message. So I think it's another reason that it's helpful to have a
Mm,
manuscript. Something to think about, but it's what I believe will help you be better, more clear in as you go through the
mm.
passage with them. Well, our time's escaped us. Any final thoughts before we close our time? The next 2 weeks, I'm taking classes. I will be in class Tuesday morning. Well, my Tuesday morning. So uh, I won't be able to do our time together for the next 2 Tuesdays, but that'll give us some time to prepare to start on the prophetic genre when we gather back together in a couple weeks. So,
Mm.
so the next 2 weeks, I'll be in class. Um, so then that'll be June something,
June the second,
June
I think.
16.
Okay.
Mm.
Okay.
And by 16th, yeah.
Yeah. And then we'll, Lord willing, dive into prophecy. It should be
Mm,
fun. Like Dwayne said, right? The end's getting closer. It's becoming more obvious. So we'll talk about end time stuff, but mainly how to approach prophetic genre, um, how to study it, understand it, and then go through it. Okay.
yep.
All right. Shulong, would you be willing to close our time together in prayer?